Hello there, and welcome to Science for Sleep, where curiosity gets cozy and science takes the scenic route to slumber. Tonight, we're taking a quiet walk through something that's been quietly walking you through life all along. A whisper in your mind, a tug in your chest, a nudge in your choices, not a force of nature like gravity, not quite a feeling like joy or fear, and yet it steers desire, memory, focus, and even love itself, dopamine. The brain's chemical storyteller, cheerleader, and sometimes its trickster. It gets blamed for addiction and praised for ambition. It's the molecule behind motivation, the thrill of a new message, the craving for one more episode, one more cookie, one more scroll. But is it really controlling us, or just offering suggestions that feel a little too good to ignore? Before we unravel its mysterious influence, its hidden circuits and hopeful whispers, I'd love to know, where are you listening from tonight? And what sort of day has your brain just wandered through? If you find comfort in these quiet explorations, if this gives your thoughts a soft place to rest, I'd be ever so grateful if you gave this episode a like, maybe even subscribed. It helps this little channel find others looking for a gentle pause too. Now, settle in, close the tabs, soften your shoulders, let the weight of the day melt just a little more. Because in the quiet corners of your mind, there's a story unfolding, one molecule at a time. Let's begin. Dopamine doesn't announce itself when it arrives. It doesn't shout or knock or hold up a neon sign. It drips, quietly, gently, like the moment right before you realize you're smiling, or the beat just before you reach for your phone. It's the whisper behind a sudden burst of energy, the rush when you're almost done with a task, the tug that pulls your attention toward the cookie, the inbox, the person across the room, and yet, for something so invisible, so tiny, it has a remarkable gift for puppeteering desire, for tilting the scales toward action or inaction. Imagine this. You're on the couch, scrolling. You tell yourself, just 5 more minutes. You don't move. You don't really want to. And then suddenly a thumbnail appears. Something you didn't know you wanted to see. A title that promises a laugh, or an insight, or drama. And your thumb moves without permission. That tiny shift, that nudge toward novelty, it's dopamine. Or picture this. You're halfway through a task you've put off for days. Maybe it's laundry or taxes. You don't love doing it. But now you're in it, and it starts to click. You fold the last shirt, you fill out the last number. And strangely, despite the boring start, you feel a kind of warmth. Not elation, but completion. Dopamine again. We often call dopamine the pleasure chemical. But that's not quite true. It's not about the reward itself. It's the anticipation, the seeking, the tension of maybe. It's the space between what is and what could be. If serotonin is the feeling of contentment, dopamine is the thrill of the chase. It's not the cake. It's the smell of it baking in the other room. It's not the like. It's the pause just before the notification buzzes. It's not the love. It's the flutter right before the text is sent. Dopamine is why we try, why we repeat, why we reach, and sometimes why we can't stop. There's a funny paradox here. We feel like we're making choices every day, picking this or that, swiping right or closing the tab. But underneath those micro decisions is a slow, persistent trickle of neurochemistry, a molecule that whispers, maybe this time will be good. Dopamine creates that sense of maybe, that just one more, that what if. It doesn't come in all at once. It spikes, it teases, it plays. Sometimes it makes us brave. The rush of starting a new project, the joy of a new idea, the energy to chase a dream. Those are dopamine's gifts. It's the reason you got out of bed on the morning you didn't want to. It's the reason you took the risk. Other times, it tricks us into loops, refreshing, scrolling, binging, gambling, drinking, overworking, overthinking. It's a system meant to help us seek and survive, but in a world of endless options, it can become a labyrinth. You don't always realize you're chasing it. That's part of its magic. It doesn't feel like chasing a molecule, it feels like chasing a feeling. And here's the thing. We often assume dopamine is strongest when we finally get what we want, but studies suggest otherwise. The most dopamine is released in the anticipation of reward, not in the reward itself, the waiting, the wanting. That's where the molecule shines. It's why slot machines are so addictive. Not because you win, but because you might. It's why cliffhangers keep you watching. Why unfinished to-do lists stay in your head like little ghosts. That uncertainty, the possibility, that's dopamine's favourite playground. In psychology, this is sometimes called the reward prediction error. When something turns out better than expected, dopamine floods in. When it's exactly as expected, not so much. And if it's worse, the system quiets down. So we learn, not logically, but chemically, rewired by surprise, primed by potential. This is why our brains light up at novelty. New ideas, new people, new places, even new packaging on the same product. Novelty creates a small, sparkling pulse in the brain, and we chase it sometimes without meaning to. You may have noticed this on vacation. When everything is unfamiliar, the smells, the food, the streets, time feels fuller, richer, more textured. That's not just memory. That's dopamine too. It's helping the brain learn, absorb, explore. And then we come home, back to routine, and time flattens, motivation fades, and we don't always know why. Sometimes it's just dopamine settling back into its baseline. But that baseline, that's important too. Some of us have brains that release dopamine a little more easily, or have receptors that are a little more sensitive. Others might have lower natural levels, meaning they need more stimulation to feel the same spark. This isn't about intelligence or willpower, it's about biology, and while dopamine is often framed as good or bad, the truth is it's both, or neither. It's a messenger, a pattern spotter, a circuit whispering, "You did something, and it mattered. Do it again." The challenge is, it doesn't always know what's good for us. It only knows what felt rewarding last time. The scroll, the sugar, the compliment, the shortcut. Even if we regret it later, in the moment dopamine says, "Yes, more please." And that's why we build habits. Good ones, bad ones, weird ones. Because dopamine is the breadcrumb trail, and our brains are built to follow the crumbs. You might not realize how often it shapes your day. The way you reach for coffee first thing in the morning, that's dopamine. The ping of joy when someone remembers your name, dopamine. The sudden urge to clean your entire kitchen at 2 a.m. Oddly enough, dopamine again. But here's something even more curious. Dopamine doesn't just shape how we feel. It shapes how we learn. Your brain, right now, as it listens, is evaluating. Is this rewarding? Is this interesting? Is this soothing? And depending on the answer, it will adjust, strengthening certain pathways, pruning others. Dopamine is the chemical that tells the brain, "Hey, remember this. This mattered." And that's how it becomes a sculptor of identity, not just of desire. Over time, the patterns it reinforces become personality traits, habits, preferences, even moral choices, the pull toward kindness, the satisfaction of solving a puzzle, the rush of taking a stand. All these things are affected by the dopamine circuitry. It doesn't cause your choices, but it nudges them, like a breeze behind a sailboat. And like any breeze, it can shift with sleep, diet, stress, connection. Dopamine doesn't operate in isolation. It's part of a symphony. And when that symphony is out of tune, everything can feel a little off. Too much stimulation, too much novelty, speed, sugar, news, noise, and the system starts to burn out. Too little, too much sameness, stillness, disconnection, and the spark begins to dim. You may have felt this. The flatness after too many days online, the weird sadness that follows a binge, the emptiness that clings to unchecked dopamine loops, but just as it can spiral, it can also reset. Moments of rest, real rest, nature, silence, gentle challenge, focused effort, connection without agenda. These things gently replenish the circuitry, and the system learns again, slowly, that not all rewards have to be loud or fast or new. Some of the best dopamine doesn't come from novelty, it comes from meaning, from doing the thing day after day that slowly builds into something real, from showing up, from caring, from finishing the small things no one else sees. That's a quieter dopamine, a steadier kind, and maybe, just maybe, the kind we need most. So the next time you feel pulled towards something, a craving, a click, a sudden burst of energy, pause, not to judge it, just to notice it. You're watching dopamine in the wild. It's not wrong. It's not right. It's just part of you, the explorer, the motivator, the whisper that says, maybe something better is just ahead. Sometimes it's telling the truth. Other times it's just keeping you moving. And either way, it's been with you, always, in every choice, every curiosity, every quiet chase, a molecule that doesn't ask for attention, and yet shapes so much of what we pay attention to. Sleep, hunger, risk, learning, love. Even this moment now, the soft focus in your thoughts, the way your attention drifts but gently stays, that too may be dopamine at work, not as a command, but as a companion. Long before we had microscopes, molecules, or magnetic resonance imaging, we had feelings, strange ones, the kind that appear without permission, a sudden joy for no reason, a strange hunger in the middle of contentment, a drive so strong it overrides logic, or the haunting ache of wanting something you've never had. Ancient humans didn't call it dopamine, but they noticed the tug, the pull, the flame that lives behind the eyes, the thing that made a person leave their village for an unseen horizon, fall deeply in love, or risk everything for a new idea. They gave it many names: spirit, desire, temptation, inspiration, madness, bliss. Across the centuries, that mysterious force, that urge towards something, was often explained not through biology, but through myth. In Greek mythology, desire was personified as Eros, the god of attraction, a mischievous, beautiful figure, always pointing his golden arrows toward hearts that didn't ask to be pierced. He didn't wait for consent or context. He simply struck and left the consequences behind. In many ways, Eros was the poetic version of dopamine, not responsible for love itself, but for the spark that sets the story in motion. Hindu philosophy speaks of karma, one of the 4 goals of human life, the pursuit of pleasure, passion, and emotional fulfillment. Karma isn't framed as a weakness to be avoided, but as a natural sacred part of the human experience, something to be navigated, not suppressed. In Buddhism, there's a more cautious approach. Tanha, or craving, is seen as the root of suffering, not because desire is evil, but because it's endless. One desire leads to another, and another, until the mind becomes tangled in its own longings. The cycle of dopamine before dopamine had a name. Even early Christianity wrestled with the question of internal motivation. The concept of temptation, a pull towards something forbidden or indulgent, reflects a deep human awareness that not all impulses are trustworthy, that some inner nudges come with consequences, that sometimes the brain asks for things the heart later regrets. And in folklore, you see dopamine hiding behind every enchanted object, every forbidden fruit, every deal made with a grinning trickster. The stories of just one bite, just one wish, just one more look. These weren't morality plays so much as early neuroscience written in metaphor. But not all cultural interpretations were warnings. Many saw this mysterious drive as sacred. The Vikings believed in berserkers, warriors who entered a trance of uncontrollable rage and power before battle. A surge of emotion so intense it took over the body. Was it supernatural? Was it mushrooms? Or was it a primitive burst of dopamine mixed with adrenaline and fear? In ancient China, qi, the vital energy, was said to flow through the body, influencing health, thought, and movement. Though broader than any one molecule, qi reflects a similar idea, that unseen forces animate our choices, that something deep within us pushes us toward action. And then there were the alchemists, medieval seekers who believed the human body was a furnace of transformation, not just turning lead into gold, but turning base instincts into enlightenment. They didn't name neurotransmitters, but they intuited that emotion had structure, that longing had chemistry, that desire could be harnessed, or it could devour. Fast forward to the Enlightenment, and human emotion began its long shift from the mystical to the mechanical. In the 18th century, thinkers like David Hume wrote that reason was the slave of the passions, that no matter how logical we pretend to be, it is our emotions that truly guide our choices, a quiet foreshadowing of dopamine's starring role. Still, for centuries, we explained motivation with character, morality, or even humours, those four ancient fluids that supposedly governed our moods: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If you felt too driven, perhaps your bile was off. If you felt listless, maybe your blood needed balancing. A poetic way of saying something inside you is whispering, and we're not quite sure why. And then, only recently in human history came a change. In 1957, two scientists named Kathleen Montague and Arvid Carlson isolated a strange chemical in the brain. At first, no one was sure what it did. It didn't fit into the classical understanding of nerves simply firing like wires. But Carlson kept looking. In 1958, he discovered that dopamine wasn't just floating around aimlessly. It was essential. It acted like a messenger, a translator between neurons. More than that, it was necessary for movement, mood, and motivation. He had stumbled onto one of the brain's master keys. For this, Carlson would eventually win the Nobel Prize. But at the time, the field was still young. Scientists began tracing dopamine's pathways from the ventral tegmental area to the nucleus accumbens, regions that lit up during pleasure, reward, anticipation. Soon, it became clear that dopamine wasn't just a supporting player. It was central. It helped explain addiction, depression, schizophrenia, even Parkinson's disease. A single molecule, acting in different amounts and places, could radically alter the course of a life. But here's the curious part. Even after we gave it a name, measured its levels, mapped its pathways, we still told stories. We still needed metaphors, because while dopamine might explain the how, it rarely explains the why. Why this craving, and not that one? Why this joy at finishing a puzzle, while someone else feels it on the dance floor? Why does the same song give one person chills, and another person nothing at all? Culture, memory, personality, all layered on top of the chemical, like a symphony playing over a rhythm that's always been there. Different societies have interpreted desire in different ways. In the modern West, dopamine has become almost a buzzword, a way to explain everything from TikTok habits to morning routines. We hear phrases like dopamine detox, dopamine hit, low dopamine day, often without understanding what the molecule actually does. In some ways, dopamine has become a new kind of myth, a scientific-sounding stand-in for the same old mysteries. Why do I want this? Why can't I stop? Why does this feel good? In Japan, there's a word, ikigai, meaning a reason for being. It refers to the quiet joy of purpose, the daily satisfaction of meaning. Not spikes of dopamine, but a gentle, steady rhythm. A neurochemical tide that pulls us forward without crashing. In Scandinavian culture, the concept of lagom, not too much, not too little, reflects a similar balance. A life where pleasure isn't hunted but allowed, where the nervous system isn't constantly chasing novelty but resting in sufficiency. In the digital age, however, dopamine is being stretched into new territory. The ancient hunter-gatherer brain, built to scan the forest for berries, faces, patterns, is now scanning screens. Instead of a rewarding meal after a day's effort, we get a reward every few seconds. Scroll, click, buzz, like. The molecule hasn't changed, but the environment has, and across cultures, we're just beginning to understand what that means. Some thinkers now argue we are in a global dopamine imbalance, overfed on novelty, undernourished in meaning, that we've trained our brains to expect more, faster, shinier, while feeling less. Others suggest this is simply the next phase of adaptation, that our minds will catch up, that dopamine, like language or electricity, will find its equilibrium in a new world. Either way, the ancient feeling remains, that moment when something calls to you, the hunger to learn, to try, to connect. A silent signal from within that says, there's something out there for you. Sometimes it's profound, sometimes it's a snack. Either way, it moves you. And whether you called it eros or chi or craving or chaos, the feeling has always been there. And now, at last, we've given it a name. Dopamine, not a god, not a curse, not a spell, but a molecule. One that helped early humans chase the mammoth, that helped monks finish manuscripts, that helps a tired student write one more sentence before bed, that helps you right now drift into sleep with a soft curiosity in your chest. You've always had it, and now you know it by name. If you could shrink yourself down, way down, past your thoughts, past your blood, past the folds of your brain, you'd find a strange kind of language unfolding, a language not of words or logic, but of pulses, pathways, and tiny messengers darting from cell to cell. This is the language of your nervous system, and dopamine is one of its most eloquent whispers. So what is it? Chemically, dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a molecule that helps neurons talk to each other, but more specifically, it belongs to a group called catecholamines, which also includes adrenaline and noradrenaline, the fight or flight cousins. It's made in your brain from an amino acid called tyrosine, which your body gets from food, things like almonds, bananas, eggs, and avocados. Inside special nerve cells, tyrosine is transformed into L-dopa, then into dopamine. From there, it's either used directly or converted into those other catecholamines, depending on what your body needs. But dopamine isn't just floating around randomly. It follows circuits, like an underground rail system guiding thoughts, choices, and cravings. There are 4 main dopamine pathways in the brain, and each one has its own job, its own story to tell. Let's meet them. The first is the mesolimbic pathway, often called the reward pathway. This is the most famous, the one that lights up when you experience pleasure or even anticipate it. It starts in the ventral tegmental area, a little patch of cells deep in the midbrain, and extends to the nucleus accumbens, a key player in motivation and reinforcement. When you eat something delicious, hear your favourite song, or get a nice message from someone you love, this pathway fires, not just because the thing is good, but because your brain wants you to do it again. It learns, it remembers, it rewards. But it's not just about joy, it's about learning what matters, what predicts a reward. This is why it also responds to cues, the jingle before your favourite show, the smell of coffee brewing, the typing bubble in a chat. Your brain is playing a game of pattern recognition, and dopamine is how it keeps score. The second pathway is the mesocortical pathway, which connects that same midbrain region to the prefrontal cortex, the thinking part of your brain, right behind your forehead. This area handles planning, attention, and decision-making. When you focus deeply on a task, when you weigh options, when you delay gratification, or work toward a long-term goal, this is where dopamine lends its hand. People with too little dopamine in this pathway may struggle with focus, memory, or motivation. It's one of the reasons dopamine is linked to conditions like ADHD, where the signal-to-noise ratio in these circuits is off balance. Dopamine isn't just a pleasure button, it's a signal that helps you care, that helps you persist. The third pathway is the nigrostriatal pathway, which runs from a region called the substantia nigra to the striatum. This one is crucial for movement. When you walk, reach, or even shift in bed, dopamine in this pathway is helping your muscles coordinate smoothly. In Parkinson's disease, this pathway begins to falter. The dopamine-producing cells die off slowly, leading to tremors, stiffness, and difficulty moving. This was one of the first clear clues that dopamine wasn't just about feelings, it was about function. It was embedded in the very rhythm of the body. And then there's the tuberine fundibular pathway. Less glamorous perhaps, but important. It connects the hypothalamus to the pituitary gland and helps regulate hormones, especially prolactin, which affects things like milk production and sexual satisfaction. In other words, dopamine isn't just about what you want, it's also involved in what you are, how you move, think, reproduce, survive. But how does it work? How does a tiny molecule shape something as large as a decision or a craving? Let's zoom in. Imagine two neurons side by side. One wants to tell the other something, but they can't touch. There's a tiny gap between them called a synapse. So the first neuron, like a careful messenger, packs its words into chemical envelopes, neurotransmitters, and releases them into the gap. Dopamine drifts across, finds a receptor on the other side, and binds. Receptors are like locks. Dopamine is the key. When it clicks into place, the receiving neuron changes. It might fire an impulse, it might change its shape, it might begin a cascade of reactions inside the cell, but it doesn't last forever. After delivering its message, dopamine is reabsorbed or broken down. Like a whisper fading into the air, the brain is careful. Too much dopamine, too long, can be overstimulating. So it has reuptake pumps and enzymes to clean things up, restore balance. It's this balance, not too much, not too little, that allows the system to hum. And when that balance is disrupted, things shift. Addictive drugs, for example, hijack this system. Substances like cocaine, methamphetamine, or opioids don't just create artificial pleasure, they flood the brain with dopamine or prevent it from being reabsorbed, so that the signal lingers longer than it should. The brain in turn adapts. It may downregulate receptors, meaning fewer locks for dopamine to fit into. The baseline shifts. The system becomes less responsive. This is why, over time, the same amount of the drug feels less rewarding. Tolerance builds, the chase intensifies, but it's not just drugs. Many everyday habits, social media, sugar, gambling, even compulsive shopping, can create similar loops. Not because they're evil, but because they overstimulate a system built for subtlety. They're like shouting into a microphone designed for whispers. But dopamine isn't always high, it dips too. Lack of dopamine can feel like fog, a heavy blanket over motivation. It's not sadness necessarily, more like absence. The absence of drive, of sparkle, of movement. This is common in depression, where dopamine signaling may be disrupted. People describe not enjoying things they used to love, not because the things changed, but because the reward system isn't lighting up the way it once did. Some medications for depression and ADHD work by gently boosting dopamine levels, or increasing its availability in the brain. The goal isn't euphoria, it's restoration. It's helping the signal get through. Dopamine also fluctuates naturally, with sleep, stress, diet, and circadian rhythm. In the morning, dopamine tends to rise, gently nudging you toward wakefulness, readiness. As the day goes on, it tapers. If sleep is poor or stress is chronic, the rhythm may stutter. You might feel wired but tired, restless but unmotivated, You may even recognize the strange paradox. Staying up late, doom scrolling, knowing it doesn't feel good, but unable to stop. That too can be dopamine, a confused loop playing on repeat. The brain looking for resolution, for novelty, for a hit of maybe this will help. But the beautiful thing is, the system can reset through focus, through rest, through choosing slower, quieter pleasures, through learning how to feel satisfaction without needing spikes. That brings us to one of the most elegant and misunderstood features of dopamine. It doesn't cause pleasure, it points to it. It says, go there, try this. That was good, do it again. But it also lets go. It adapts, which means you can change your habits, change your focus, change what lights you up. Not instantly, not with force, but with time. And in that way, dopamine isn't just a mechanism, it's a mirror, reflecting what you've taught your brain to love and what you might still teach it to value next. Let's linger just a little longer in the chemistry of wanting. Because dopamine isn't only a molecule of action or motion, it's also a quiet architect, laying down tracks in the dark, building emotional memory, helping your brain decide what matters and what doesn't. One of the most fascinating roles dopamine plays is in learning through prediction, not just noticing what feels good, but comparing what happened to what you expected. This is called reward prediction error, and it's one of the most important concepts in modern neuroscience. Here's how it works. Imagine you're handed a cup of tea. You expect it to taste just okay. It's a brand you've never tried, but you take a sip and it's delightful, unexpectedly rich, a little floral, subtly sweet. In that moment, dopamine spikes. Why? Because your brain made a guess, and reality exceeded it. That tiny gap between expectation and reality, that's dopamine's playground. The brain treats it like a lesson. It says, remember this. Next time, choose this brand. It surprised us, in a good way. Now imagine the reverse. You expect your favourite tea, but it's gone stale. It tastes flat, slightly sour. The dopamine system quiets. The signal fades. Don't repeat this, it says. Adjust the pattern. Over time, these small prediction errors shape how we navigate the world. They sculpt taste. They guide habits. They help us find meaning in patterns. And in this way, dopamine becomes not just a motivator, but a kind of emotional compass. It pulls us toward the interesting, the engaging, the rewarding. It pushes us away from what's dull, painful, or disappointing. And it does so in a way that's deeply personal. Because no two people have identical dopamine maps. What lights up your brain might do nothing for someone else. That favourite book, that perfect sandwich, that one tiny compliment that fills your chest with warmth. All of that is filtered through the unique wiring of your reward system. It's built by genetics, yes, but also by experience. Every win, every failure, every new flavour, every unexpected kindness, all of it leaves a mark. Dopamine helps us assign value to the world around us. It helps us decide what's worth repeating, what's worth chasing, what's worth avoiding, even when we don't realise it. This is especially clear in early development. For infants and young children, dopamine is a guiding light. It rewards curiosity. It nudges them to explore, to repeat, to play. The sheer joy you see in a toddler discovering how stacking blocks works, that's dopamine cheering in the background. And as the brain matures, those circuits evolve. In adolescence, dopamine levels increase sharply, especially in areas linked to novelty seeking and risk-taking. This isn't a flaw, it's part of how the young brain learns. It's wired to try things, to seek rewards, make mistakes, and slowly refine its models of what's good, what's dangerous, what's meaningful. That's why teenagers are often drawn to strong sensations, loud music, fast movement, emotional intensity. Their dopamine systems are extra sensitive, like a microphone turned up high. It's overwhelming at times, but essential for learning. And as we grow older, that sensitivity shifts. Not disappears, but settles. We begin to favour deeper, slower, more predictable rewards. The joy of a familiar song, the comfort of a routine, the quiet satisfaction of progress. This shift is part of how dopamine helps us adapt across time. But there's more, because dopamine doesn't just track the outside world, it also listens inward. It responds to goals, even imagined ones. Just thinking about a future reward, even before you've acted, can trigger a dopamine release. That feeling of excitement before a trip, the energy you get just from writing a to-do list, the motivation that comes from seeing the finish line, even if it's far away. This is why visualization can be powerful. The brain in some ways doesn't wait for reality. If you believe something good is coming, dopamine can get the ball rolling early. But there's a flip side too. When the brain learns to expect a constant stream of little rewards, likes, clicks, comments, notifications, it can become bored more easily. The system adapts. This is called hedonic adaptation. The idea that we quickly get used to pleasure and need more of it to feel the same effect. It's not about weakness, it's about calibration. A sudden flood of dopamine feels amazing at first, but the brain adjusts, receptors pull back, the system stabilizes, and what once felt exciting now feels normal. So we seek again, chase again, refresh again. But over time, even that loop begins to dull, and that's when people describe a strange numbness, not sadness exactly, but a kind of emotional static, a loss of spark. You may have felt this after too much scrolling, too much sugar, too many half-finished tasks, a sense that nothing satisfies the way it used to. This is not brokenness, it's biology, a system trying to protect itself from overstimulation. And the good news, it can reset. Research shows that periods of intentional boredom, quiet time, nature walks, tech-free evenings can slowly restore dopamine sensitivity, like turning down the volume so you can hear the melody again. Even more powerful, the pursuit of deep work, tasks that take effort, focus, and time, tends to release dopamine more gradually, not in spikes, but in waves. And those waves tend to feel more stable, more satisfying, less addictive, more meaningful. This is the difference between a hit and a harvest. A hit is quick, a burst, gone before you know it. A harvest takes time, but it lingers, it feeds something deeper. Dopamine can do both. But the harvest is what builds resilience, identity, purpose. It's also why delayed gratification is so powerful. Choosing to wait, to resist the urge, to finish the project, to bake the bread instead of buying it. All of that activates prefrontal dopamine systems, the ones linked to executive function, planning, reasoning, patience. This is the circuitry that builds long-term joy, not just quick pleasure. And interestingly, it's also the circuitry that makes humans unique. Because while animals do have dopamine systems and use them for learning, survival, mating, we have an added layer. We can think about thinking. We can imagine future rewards, create abstract goals, and even feel motivated by ideas. That's dopamine too. The drive to write a poem, to learn a language, to help someone in need, to discover how the universe works. All abstract, all invisible, and yet incredibly real to the brain. Dopamine is what powers that long, patient pursuit. Now, if dopamine is so essential to learning, motivation, and growth, does more always mean better? Not exactly. Too little, and we may feel sluggish, unfocused, emotionally flat. Too much, especially in the wrong places, and we may feel anxious, impulsive, or even manic. In conditions like schizophrenia, for instance, excess dopamine activity, particularly in the mesolimbic system, is thought to contribute to hallucinations and delusions. Antipsychotic medications often work by blocking dopamine receptors, especially a type called D2 receptors. But that comes with trade-offs. too much blocking, and movement becomes stiff. Pleasure becomes harder to feel. Balance is delicate, and balance isn't just biochemical, it's environmental, behavioral, psychological. How we live, what we pay attention to, what we repeat, what we avoid, all of it shapes the dopamine system, and the system, in turn, shapes us. This feedback loop is how habits are formed: a cue, a craving, a response, a reward. Each time the loop completes, dopamine drops a little yes into the circuit, and so we do it again. The beauty of this, you can rewrite loops, not by force, not overnight, but by gently shifting the rewards, choosing better cues, building tiny wins. It's why routines matter, why environment matters, why self-compassion matters, because dopamine listens, and it remembers, and like a river it can carve a new path, slowly, over time, through repetition. Which brings us full circle. Dopamine is not a dictator, it doesn't control your will, it doesn't override your soul, it's a signal, a suggestion, a spark. It says, "This mattered." It asks, "Want to try again?" It whispers, "What if something wonderful is just ahead?" And in a world full of distractions, that whisper can be hard to hear. But when you slow down, when you pay attention, you can feel it. That little lift when something feels right, that moment of focus, that burst of curiosity, that soft glow of "this matters." That's dopamine, your quiet, persistent companion. Not the voice of pleasure, but the architect of meaning, the one who keeps building even while you sleep. Dopamine is often framed as a single story, a line from craving to reward. But beneath that simple arc lies something richer, a complex choreography of systems, circuits, and surprising twists. Let's wander deeper. We'll begin with something strange and surprisingly common, the dopamine paradox. You'd think that more dopamine would mean more pleasure, more drive, more joy. But sometimes it does the opposite. There are people with excess dopamine signaling, and they don't feel euphoric. They feel overwhelmed, restless, anxious, even emotionally paralyzed. Too many signals arriving too fast, like too many radio stations playing at once. The brain doesn't feel pleasure, it feels noise. This is especially true in certain psychiatric conditions, like bipolar disorder. During manic phases, dopamine levels spike. The person may feel energized, unstoppable, full of ideas, but it's not peace, it's a storm. Thoughts race, sleep disappears, the pleasure becomes compulsive, not satisfying. And on the flip side, too little dopamine in certain regions can lead to deep fatigue, emotional numbness, the absence of want. This is one of the puzzles of anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure. It's not sadness exactly, it's a missing note. The song of desire plays, but it feels silent. So dopamine isn't about more or less. It's about balance, location, and timing. And that balance can shift in surprising ways. Let's talk about anticipation. Dopamine, as we've said, isn't really about the reward itself. It's about the pursuit. But here's something odd. Sometimes anticipation is stronger than satisfaction. Think about it. You look forward to a weekend trip. You plan, you daydream, you imagine. The dopamine flows. Then the trip comes, and it's lovely, but perhaps a little quieter than the excitement you felt beforehand. Your brain was lit up before the experience more than during it. Why? Because dopamine is part of the seeking system, not the having system. It evolved to keep animals moving toward uncertain goals, not guaranteed rewards, a berry bush that might be full, a cave that might hold warmth, a risk, not a promise. So your brain leans forward. Always forward. The next thing, the next task, the next hit of maybe. It's why scrolling feels like something is about to happen, even if it rarely does. It's why cliffhangers keep us watching, even when we're tired. It's why unfinished business sticks in your head, whispering for closure. That's dopamine. keeping the doors open. Now let's look at a different door, one inside the brain, a strange one. It's called incentive sensitization, a fancy term for what happens when your brain starts wanting something more, even as you like it less. It sounds strange, but it happens with drugs, with behaviors, even with relationships. The first time, there's pleasure. The second time, maybe a little less. But the wanting grows. The brain starts to fire more in anticipation than in reception. The cues, the smell, the image, the routine light up the reward pathways, even if the actual experience no longer satisfies. This is one reason why addiction is so complex. It's not about greed, or weakness, or even pleasure. It's about a system that's learned. This thing matters, even if it no longer feels good. Dopamine is whispering, go back, try again. It worked once, remember? And so we go back. Even when the joy is gone, incentive sensitization separates wanting from liking, and that separation can be devastating or freeing once you know it's happening. But dopamine isn't just in your head. There's another twist in the tail, dopamine in the gut. Yes, your digestive system, your second brain, also produces and responds to dopamine. It's part of the enteric nervous system, a web of neurons in your intestines that helps regulate digestion, appetite, and even mood. This is part of why we talk about gut feelings, why anxiety can cause stomach aches, why joy can make you hungry, or why heartbreak makes food taste like cardboard. The gut and the brain are in constant conversation, and dopamine is part of that dialogue. Some studies even suggest that certain gut bacteria may influence dopamine production, that your microbiome, those trillions of tiny organisms living inside you, may play a role in how you feel motivation and pleasure. It's early research, but intriguing. You're not just a brain in a jar, you're a whole ecosystem, and dopamine is woven through it all. And then there's genetics. Some people are born with variations in dopamine receptor genes. The most famous is called DRD4, which affects how sensitive your receptors are to dopamine. People with certain versions of this gene are more likely to seek novelty, to take risks, to explore. This has been called the adventure gene. Though that's a bit romantic, it's not destiny. Just a slight tilt in the system, a gentle lean towards stimulation. And it's not always a gift. In environments full of opportunity, novelty seeking might lead to creativity, entrepreneurship, travel. In environments full of risk, it might lead to addiction, instability, impulsivity. The same trait, different outcomes. That's the nature of dopamine. It doesn't dictate who you are. It interacts with where you are. And then there's flow. That magical state when you lose track of time, when you're so absorbed in a task, writing, painting, running, even gardening, that everything else disappears. It's not pleasure exactly, it's alignment. And dopamine plays a role here too. In flow, dopamine is released in steady, moderate pulses, not the sharp peaks of addiction, not the valleys of boredom, just enough to keep you engaged, curious, focused. This is the system at its best, not chasing, not exhausted, just immersed, which brings us to something quietly profound. Dopamine doesn't just help you feel pleasure, it helps you construct meaning. When you do something hard and finish it, dopamine helps reinforce the value of that effort. It says, this mattered. It teaches your brain, struggle can lead to reward. This is how grit is built, how habits form, how growth happens, not through pleasure alone, but through the belief that effort is worth it. This is why delayed gratification is such a powerful predictor of success. Why people who learn to wait or to push through discomfort tend to thrive long term. Their dopamine systems are tuned not just to reward, but to process, to progress. And here's a twist. You can train this, like a muscle, by setting small goals, celebrating tiny wins, creating loops where your brain sees progress and marks it. Each check mark, each completed task, each small act of self-care, that's a breadcrumb on the path, a dopamine trace. And the more your brain sees that path, the more it will follow it. We call this behavioral reinforcement, but really, it's just the brain learning to love the trail it's walking. And if that trail leads to growth, kindness, creativity, well then dopamine isn't just biology. It's a quiet companion, a trail guide, helping you find your way. Let's drift now into the stranger corners of dopamine's story, where experiments blur into paradox, where facts whisper beside fiction, and where science meets self-reflection. We'll begin in a lab. In the 1950s, psychologists James Olds and Peter Milner conducted an experiment with rats. They implanted tiny electrodes into a region of the brain now known as the medial forebrain bundle, part of the dopamine reward pathway. The idea was to see what happened when you could electrically stimulate pleasure, press the button and get a spark of joy. What happened next surprised everyone. The rats would press the lever again and again for hours. Some ignored food, ignored sleep. They pressed until they collapsed. The scientists had discovered something powerful, a way to directly trigger the brain's dopamine system. To the rats, the button was the most important thing in the universe. And though this kind of setup would never be used on humans ethically, the implications stuck. We'd found the center of reinforcement, the mechanism of craving, not love, not logic, just raw neural desire. Later scientists refined the experiment. They learned it wasn't pleasure the rats were addicted to. It was the anticipation, the seeking, the same dopamine spike we've seen over and over again, not satisfaction, pursuit. This is what makes dopamine such a paradox. It's a molecule that makes you chase, and often keeps you chasing, even after the joy has faded. And this has led to a strange modern response. The idea of the dopamine detox. You may have heard the term floating around wellness spaces or social media, a kind of mental fast, where people intentionally avoid anything stimulating for a day or more. No phones, no screens, no sugar, no caffeine, no music, no games, no novelty. The goal? To reset the brain's reward system. The logic goes something like this. When we're constantly bombarded by little hits of dopamine, pings, likes, snacks, swipes, our baseline shifts. We get bored more easily. We crave constant input. We lose the ability to feel joy from simpler things. So, the theory says, cut out the noise, let the brain settle, give the system a break. Now, to be clear, dopamine detoxing isn't really about dopamine levels dropping. That's not how the molecule works. It's not stored up or cleaned by rest. It's produced and broken down moment by moment. But the practice behind the detox, the idea of intentional stillness, reduced stimulation, and resetting attention, that has some real psychological value. Because it's not about dopamine going away. It's about relearning what's enough. When you sit with silence, without reaching, your brain slowly recalibrates. It remembers how to listen, how to notice, how to find satisfaction not in the scroll, but in the stillness. And from that stillness, something unexpected can emerge. Intrinsic motivation. The kind of desire that doesn't need flashing lights or external rewards. The kind that grows quietly inside, like the wish to learn, to connect, to create. This is what some researchers call autonomous motivation. Doing something because it aligns with who you are, not because you were bribed, nudged, or baited into it. And guess what? Dopamine plays a role here too, but it flows differently, slower, more evenly, less about spikes, more about steady reinforcement. It rewards effort, not just outcome. Process, not just payoff. This is the dopamine of craft, of long walks, of soft focus. And for many it's the missing piece. Because in a world filled with easy hits, fast food, fast media, fast dopamine, we sometimes forget the deeper currents, but they're still there. Let's go deeper. What happens in altered states of consciousness? People who enter deep meditation, for example, sometimes report feelings of joy, clarity, timelessness, all without external input. Studies have shown that long-term meditators can experience shifts in dopamine release, especially in regions tied to attention and awareness. It's not that meditation floods the brain with pleasure. In fact, it often reduces the craving response. But it seems to reshape how dopamine interacts with focus. The reward becomes the moment itself. Similarly, in creative flow states, artists, musicians, and writers often describe a feeling of being carried, where effort becomes effortless, and the work seems to unfold on its own. In these moments, dopamine isn't pushing, it's riding alongside. A steady hum, not siren. And then there are psychedelic experiences, substances like psilocybin or LSD. While their primary effects come through serotonin pathways, they often indirectly interact with dopamine systems too. What's fascinating is that these experiences, when guided and supported, can sometimes lead to lasting changes in behaviour, reduced addiction, increased openness, greater emotional flexibility. The theory that such experiences can disrupt old reward patterns and allow new ones to form, a kind of temporary reset followed by a rewiring. But not all altered states are chemical. Some people report deep dopamine engagement through ritual, through spiritual practice, communal music, movement, chanting, and in each case the common element is focused, immersive engagement, something that captures the mind and body completely. This is the key. Dopamine doesn't ask for chaos, it asks for meaningful pursuit. Even ritual repetition, like lighting a candle at the same time each evening, or walking the same trail each morning, can bring peace. Because the brain loves pattern, predictable reward, the rhythm of expectation met. In fact, some researchers believe that predictable routines may help stabilize dopamine-sensitive conditions like ADHD, anxiety, and even depression. It's not about rigid discipline, it's about creating gentle loops the brain can trust. Even something as simple as drinking tea from your favourite cup at the same time each night can be a dopamine cue, a soft promise. Here comes calm. That's the beauty of this molecule. It doesn't demand grand gestures, it just follows your attention. And your attention is trainable. Let's explore one last paradox. Dopamine is deeply connected to hope. When we imagine a better future, even vaguely, dopamine stirs. It asks, what if? It nudges us toward the door. It doesn't need proof, just possibility. This is why hope can be so powerful and so dangerous. It keeps us going in dark times, believing something good could happen, even without evidence. But it can also lead us into loops, hoping for a change that never comes, waiting for a message that doesn't arrive, returning to something that keeps hurting us, because maybe this time will be different. Dopamine doesn't know the difference between a healthy hope and a false one. It just knows you're still looking, still seeking, still leaning toward a spark. And that's where awareness helps. Because when you understand dopamine, you can begin to notice the patterns, not to shame them, not to fight them, but simply to see, to ask, is this pursuit feeding me? Or is it draining me? Is this loop nourishing? Or is it noise? And when you notice gently, the balance begins to shift. You find new rewards, you find older ones that were hiding. You find the quiet joy of being in motion, not frantic, not chasing, but moving with care. That's when dopamine becomes something more than chemistry. It becomes a compass, a kind of biological poetry, mapping your desires across the landscape of experience. Because at its core, dopamine is your system's way of saying, this matters, try again, keep going. Something good might be around the corner. and sometimes it's already here. The story of dopamine, like so many things in science, didn't begin with a breakthrough. It began with a question, and as with most good questions, it started with something we couldn't quite explain. Why do we feel motivated? What makes us repeat a behaviour? Why does something feel worth doing? Long before we knew molecules were involved, people noticed patterns in human behaviour. Strange forces that seemed to pull us towards certain things, even when they didn't always make sense. The thrill of the chase, the itch to try again, the way a small success could feed an entire day. For most of history, those forces were explained through philosophy, poetry, myth. But then came the tools, and with them, the first glimmer of something deeper. The tale of dopamine, in its scientific form, begins quietly, in the early 20th century. In 1910, a Polish chemist named George Barger and his colleague James Ewins were studying substances related to adrenaline. They isolated a compound they named dopamine, based on its chemical structure, a molecule with an amine group attached to a dihydroxyphenyl structure. At the time, they didn't know what it did. It was just a compound, an ingredient, a name. For decades, it stayed in the background of neuroscience, a footnote in the growing encyclopedia of biochemistry. Then, in 1957, everything changed. A Swedish scientist named Arvid Carlsson was working with Parkinsonian symptoms in animals. Researchers had already noticed that L-Dopa, a chemical precursor, could reverse motor impairments in rabbits and mice. But no one quite understood why. Carlsson suspected that dopamine might be more than just a stepping stone to other neurotransmitters like norepinephrine. So he did something simple and brilliant. He gave animals L-Dopa, watched their behaviour improve, and then traced the dopamine pathways in their brains using a technique called histofluorescence. It revealed something stunning. Dopamine wasn't just a minor chemical, it was a neurotransmitter, a key player in motor control, a molecule with a message. And that message, it seemed, was essential for movement, motivation, and mood. This discovery earned Carlsson the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in the year 2000. But even back in the late 1950s, his findings caused a ripple effect. Suddenly, dopamine wasn't just chemistry. It was neurology. It was psychiatry. It was behaviour. And researchers began asking bigger questions. They started mapping where dopamine lived in the brain, in tiny, deep-seated clusters of neurons like the substantia nigra and ventral tegmental area. They followed its trails to the striatum, the prefrontal cortex, the nucleus accumbens, regions linked to motion, decision-making, attention, and emotion. In 1960, researchers confirmed that Parkinson's disease was linked to the death of dopamine-producing neurons in the substantia nigra, and with that discovery came a new wave of treatment, using L-Dopa as a therapy. The transformation was dramatic. Patients who had been frozen in their bodies were able to move again, not cured, but unblocked, like a gate had been opened. It was one of modern medicine's first major victories against a neurodegenerative disease, and dopamine was at the heart of it. In the following years, scientists turned their attention to psychiatry. In the 1970s, they began connecting excess dopamine activity to the symptoms of schizophrenia, particularly the hallucinations and delusions that seem to arise without external cause. The dopamine hypothesis of schizophrenia was born, the idea that overactive dopamine transmission, particularly in the mesolimbic pathway, could explain the hyperactive perceptions and thoughts seen in psychosis. Antipsychotic medications were developed, many of them designed to block dopamine receptors, especially the D2 subtype, and they worked, sometimes too well. Because dopamine wasn't only involved in hallucinations, it also supported pleasure, motivation, and movement. Block the signal too broadly, and patients began to lose the ability to feel joy, to engage, to move freely. This was a crucial turning point. It revealed how delicate the dopamine system is, how easily balance can become imbalance, how too much or too little in one area could affect everything. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, dopamine's profile continued to grow. Researchers found strong dopamine involvement in addiction, especially substances like cocaine and methamphetamine, which dramatically increased dopamine activity in the brain's reward circuits. They found that gambling, eating, sex, and even video games could activate these same circuits, not because they were inherently dangerous, but because the brain couldn't always distinguish between natural and artificial rewards. The phrase reward pathway entered the popular lexicon. People began calling dopamine the pleasure chemical, though as we now know that's not quite right. It's not pleasure, it's wanting. The systems that make you enjoy something and the systems that make you want to do it again are related but not the same, and dopamine lives in the latter. It teaches the brain. This led to a reward, remember this. It became clear that dopamine drives behavior, not through command, but through reinforcement. And that's when a new question emerged. Could we shape dopamine systems intentionally? In the 2000s and 2010s, this idea began gaining traction in psychology and behavioral science. The concept of neuroplasticity, that the brain is moldable, that circuits can grow and fade with use, meant that dopamine wasn't just a reaction. It was a feedback loop, a behavior, a result, a dopamine pulse, and then a stronger behavior. The more the loop repeated, the stronger the pathway became. And if that was true, could we build better loops? Researchers began looking at habit formation, delayed gratification, goal setting, addiction recovery, all through the lens of dopamine. Tiny rewards for small behaviors, like checking off a task or completing a short workout, were found to reinforce consistency. Apps, games, and devices were built around this very principle. It worked, but it also raised ethical questions. Because if dopamine could be triggered by artificial means, algorithms, likes, endless scrolling, then wasn't it possible to hijack the system, to build traps made of feedback loops? The tech world caught on. Suddenly user engagement became a dopamine game. Notifications were read for a reason. Content was designed for infinite scroll. Rewards were intermittent, random enough to keep you curious, consistent enough to keep you hooked. Psychologists warned of dopamine exhaustion, the quiet burnout that happens when the brain is overstimulated but undernourished, when nothing feels exciting anymore, when rest feels boring, when real life feels flat. And still, dopamine whispered, maybe the next thing. This then is the story so far. From a forgotten compound, to a central neurotransmitter, to a scaffold for movement, motivation and memory, to a symbol, sometimes misunderstood, for desire itself. And we're still learning. Today, researchers are studying dopamine's role in creativity, curiosity, moral decision-making, and even political beliefs. There's evidence it may affect how we interpret risk, how we respond to novelty, how we learn from mistakes. We now know there are multiple types of dopamine receptors, D1 through D5, each with their own functions, sensitivities, and locations. Some excite neurons, others inhibit, some linger, some flicker and fade. There's no single dopamine button in the brain. There is only a symphony, subtle, adaptive, ever-changing. And perhaps most beautifully, dopamine is a reminder of how biology and experience intertwine. Because this molecule, tiny as it is, doesn't operate in isolation. It listens to your habits, your context, your beliefs, your attention. And in turn, it helps you learn what to care about, what to remember, what to try again. So even now, lying here, listening, thinking softly about your own experience, dopamine is at work. Not pushing, not demanding, just leaving small markers, tiny signals. This mattered. That moment of calm, that moment of understanding, that moment of maybe. You're still learning, and the molecule is still listening. Let's step back now, far from the microscopes, far from the lab rats and molecular diagrams. Let's drift to the quieter edges of this story, where science starts to blur into wonder, where questions no longer fit neatly into equations, where dopamine, for all its precision, becomes something more like poetry. Because if a molecule shapes our wants, our habits, our hopes, what does that say about us? About the self? About free will? Let's ask gently, without rushing toward an answer. What if the things you've wanted your whole life, that job, that praise, that second helping, that moment of applause, what if those weren't truly your choices, but subtle echoes of reinforcement? What if a part of you was simply following the trail of little chemical breadcrumbs, dopamine pulses left behind by past pleasures, past surprises, past survival? Does that make the self an illusion? Does it reduce you to a puppet of biology? Or, and here's a softer thought, does it make your brain a kind of co-author, a living journal that remembers what has mattered, what has lit you up, what has hurt, what has healed? A companion that gently asks with every nudge and whisper, should we try that again? Dopamine doesn't force, it suggests, and we are more than our suggestions. Because while dopamine might light up at the idea of a cookie, or a text message, or a risk, you are the one who can pause. You are the one who can reflect. You are the one who can choose a deeper reward, even when the shortcut feels easier. So perhaps free will isn't the absence of chemistry. Maybe it's the dance with it. Maybe freedom is not the rejection of the impulse, but the recognition of it. The ability to say, I see what's happening in me, and I will steer from here. A sailboat doesn't control the wind, but it can still set a course. And dopamine is the breeze. Now let's shift to something else. A question that's both ancient and oddly modern. What is happiness really? For centuries, philosophers have wrestled with this. From Aristotle's notion of eudaimonia, a flourishing life, to the Stoic idea of tranquility, to the Buddhist goal of freedom from craving. Each approach says something quietly radical, that happiness is not simply the fulfillment of desire, but the transformation of it. And science, in its own quiet way, seems to agree, because dopamine isn't content, it's pursuit. It is by definition a signal that something is missing, that something lies ahead, that something could be better. This is beautiful and exhausting. Beautiful because it fuels growth, curiosity, exploration. Exhausting because it never quite lets us rest. You reach a goal and dopamine falls, you enjoy the win, and soon the buzz fades. This is called the dopamine dip, and it's part of the system. It's how the brain resets, how it gets ready for the next thing. But philosophically, it raises a haunting idea. What if desire never ends? What if we're all just walking, not towards satisfaction, but in a circle of wanting? One researcher once put it like this: dopamine is not the reward, it's the signal that the reward is nearby. But if the signal always precedes the reward, and the reward is always temporary, then what are we really chasing? And here's where things get interesting, because in some traditions, especially contemplative or meditative ones, the goal is not to fuel dopamine, but to step outside of it, not to become dull, but to become free, to stop chasing, to stop craving, to stop scanning the horizon for the next hit of, maybe this will make me happy, and instead, to arrive, just here, now, a moment without pursuit, without judgment, without anticipation. It's hard, but not impossible. Studies have shown that mindfulness practices can shift how the brain uses dopamine. Instead of spiking in response to external novelty, the system begins to respond more gently to internal states. Breath, awareness, presence. It's as if the brain learns a new kind of reward. Not loud, not fast, but full. This leads us to a deeper question. If dopamine is always pointing to the next thing, can we ever be satisfied with the now? Is contentment a chemical glitch, or is it a different circuit entirely? Some scientists point to serotonin, another neurotransmitter, often linked to mood, sleep, and contentment. They propose a kind of balance. Dopamine pulls us forward, serotonin grounds us here. But even that model is a simplification, because what we're really talking about is meaning. And meaning is not a molecule. Meaning is what emerges when we connect moments, when we look at a difficult choice or a long effort or a bittersweet goodbye and say, yes, that mattered. Dopamine helps tag those moments. But the meaning, the story, the reflection, the memory, that's yours. That's human. Here's another angle. What about love? Not the quick kind, not the crush, the swipe, the flirt, but the long, slow, real kind. The kind that persists through boredom, through pain, through routine. Dopamine plays a role in attraction, sure, in novelty, in the early rush, but long-term love, that's built with more than chemistry. It's built with intention, with memory, with showing up again and again, long after the thrill has faded. That too is a reward system, but it's not built on spikes, it's built on presence. And maybe that's the secret. Maybe we were never meant to chase happiness like a carrot on a stick. Maybe we were meant to grow into it, to widen our definition of pleasure, from excitement to purpose, from novelty to ritual, from spike to rhythm. Because the truth is, dopamine will never stop whispering. It will never stop pointing. That's its job. But we don't have to follow every time. Sometimes the most powerful move is to notice the whisper and stay where we are. To say, thank you, I hear you, but I'm okay right now. That's not repression, that's evolution. And finally, here's the softest question of all. What is a life well lived? From one view, it might look like dopamine's dream. A string of adventures, achievements, check marks, trophies, a parade of pursuit. From another view, it might be quieter. A life filled with small rituals, a garden tended, a craft practiced, a child taught, a promise kept, a story shared. A life where dopamine still dances, but doesn't drive. Where the pursuit becomes less about the next thing, and more about being present with this thing. Because the real miracle isn't that dopamine moves us. It's that we can notice it moving, and still choose how we respond. That we're not just the sum of our chemicals, we are the sum of our awareness of them. And so, dear listener, as you lie there, eyes soft, breath slow, you might feel the faint tug of thoughts, goals, cravings. That's okay. That's your brain doing what it's built to do. Just smile at it. And remember, you are more than your molecules. You are the one who listens to them. You are the calm within the current, the silence between the sparks. And maybe, just maybe, that is enough. You don't need a brain scan to find dopamine. It's there. Every morning you open your eyes and reach for your phone. It's there when your stomach growls at the sight of a bakery window. It's in the skip of your heart when someone texts, "on my way," or the sting of absence when no one does. It's in your playlists, your to-do lists, your impulse buys. It's in your joy and your doom scrolling. Dopamine isn't tucked away in the lab. It lives in your day-to-day. Let's wander through that, slowly. Take your phone, for example. Every notification, that little red dot, that buzz, that banner, is a dopamine cue. Not because it guarantees joy, but because it promises possibility. The brain doesn't know if that buzz is good news or spam, but it knows it's new, and new means maybe. That maybe is dopamine's favourite flavour, so we reach, again and again. And it's not just tech. Your fridge is a dopamine playground. That chocolate bar, the crunch of chips, the cold orange juice, all of them are mini reward loops, especially when paired with stress or boredom. Because dopamine doesn't just remember pleasure, it remembers relief. So if your brain once learned that cookies quiet the anxiety, guess what it'll ask for next time? Not a hug, not a breath, a cookie. And this doesn't make you weak, it makes you human. The system is built to learn, and it learned. But, and here's the beauty, it can unlearn too. Let's talk about routines. They may not feel thrilling, they may not make dopamine soar, but they offer predictable reward, a rhythm your brain can trust. You brush your teeth, you stretch, you make your bed. Nothing viral, nothing dramatic. But each act is a soft signal. I did what I said I'd do. And that, over time, builds a different kind of dopamine, the kind tied to agency, the quiet pride of keeping promises to yourself. This is why habit stacking works. Not because habits are fun, but because consistency becomes the reward. Your brain learns, when I do this, I feel anchored, so you keep going. Now, let's talk music. Ever wonder why a song can make you feel something deep before a single lyric plays? That moment, when the chorus almost drops, when the beat almost returns, that's anticipatory dopamine. The brain knows what's coming, and it leans forward just a bit, and then release. That's pleasure, but also pattern recognition. A reward predicted, then confirmed. It's why we replay favourite songs, not just to hear them again, but to feel that anticipation again. Our brains love patterns that break, then return, tension, then resolution. That's dopamine's rhythm. Let's move from headphones to heads of state. Because dopamine isn't just personal, it's cultural. Across societies, stories of pursuit and reward dominate myths, religions and media. The hero's journey, the underdog win, the one day I'll make it dream. These are dopamine tales, narratives built on the arc of effort, reward. And even when we know how the movie ends, we keep watching. Because it's not about surprise, it's about hope. The feeling that maybe, if we try, if we wait, if we work, something good lies ahead. This shapes not just entertainment, but economics. Entire industries are built on intermittent reinforcement. The casino slot machine model applied to everything from social media to dating apps. Not consistent reward, but randomized reward. Enough wins to keep you trying. Enough losses to make you want the next win. The result? Engagement. The outcome? Often fatigue. Because your brain wasn't built for endless stimulation. It's built for cycles. Effort, reward, rest. When rest disappears, dopamine becomes distorted. You don't feel motivated, just restless. Not satisfied, just stuck. So, where does real reward come from? Some say flow, the deep absorbing work state we touched on earlier. Others say service, doing things for others without expecting praise. Some say ritual or nature or craft. But underneath it all is the same truth. Dopamine wants to learn what matters, and you are the teacher. So if your days are filled with noise, your brain will chase noise. But if your days contain quiet joy, your brain will start to value quiet joy. A walk at golden hour, a journal beside a cup of tea, the long effort of building something you care about, the short effort of making your space feel like yours. All of these can become dopamine loops, and over time, they build emotional gravity, patterns the brain orbits because they offer real nourishment. Of course, culture complicates this. We're taught to equate success with big rewards, fame, wealth, status, and dopamine does respond to those for a while. But studies show that once basic needs are met, more external success doesn't equal more happiness. In fact, beyond a point, the chase often becomes hollow. You get the thing, but the feeling fades, so you set a new goal and run again. This is the hedonic treadmill, dopamine's less romantic cousin. The good news? You can step off the treadmill, not by giving up, but by changing the kind of reward you seek. Ask, what makes me feel alive? Not just excited, not just distracted, but full. Maybe it's writing, gardening, fixing things, playing with kids, Making music, deep conversations, whatever it is, it probably offers deep delayed reward, the kind dopamine was meant to mark, not the sugar rush, but the long, slow burn. And here's a secret. Even boredom has a role. Because boredom is not the absence of dopamine, it's your brain asking for meaning. It's the empty page waiting to be filled. The silence that invites creation. If you can sit with boredom, just a little longer, without grabbing your phone, you may find something surprising waiting beneath it. A new reward. A subtle one. One that you create. And in that act of creating your own reward instead of consuming someone else's, dopamine becomes something wiser. It becomes aligned. Now, let's touch on humour. Because yes, even laughter is a kind of reward. Think of the setup and punchline. The brain hears the setup, makes a prediction, and then the punchline breaks that pattern in a clever way. Surprise. Just recognition, just laughter. Another tiny dopamine spark. This is why jokes land best when the audience is alert. Why timing matters. Why certain memes catch fire. The brain loves tiny bursts of, oh, I get it. And even though it's fleeting, it adds up. In fact, moments of levity may help keep our reward systems flexible, reminding the brain that not all reward is earned. Some of it is grace, a cat being ridiculous, a stranger smiling, a pun so bad it loops back to good. These things don't move your life forward, but they give it rhythm, and dopamine loves rhythm. That brings us finally to identity, because over time, the things your brain finds rewarding become part of who you are. The runner who feels calm after miles, the artist who lights up at a blank canvas, the parent who feels joy in their child's giggle, the listener who finds peace in a quiet voice about molecules just before sleep. These identities weren't built overnight. They were sculpted, slowly, by dopamine. Each time the system said yes, the brain whispered, more of this. And so you became yourself, one reward at a time, not because dopamine dictated it, but because you taught it what to love. Let's take a deep breath, in and out. Now, let's loosen the grip of what is and wander into what could be. Because when you really think about dopamine, the way it shapes desire, behavior, and reward, it's not just biology, it's story. A story your brain tells itself about what's worth chasing, what's worth loving, what's worth remembering. But what happens when you change the story? Let's play a little. What if you could turn dopamine off? Imagine a world where the molecule of motivation, of seeking, of wanting, simply stopped whispering. No push to check your phone, no craving for sugar, no longing for approval or progress or praise. At first it might sound peaceful, a still mind. No more internal to-do list tugging at you, no more urgency. But then, nothing moves. No spark to create, no reason to get up, no hunger, no curiosity. Because dopamine isn't just a nuisance, it's the heartbeat of initiative. When researchers have disrupted dopamine systems in animals, especially in regions like the nucleus accumbens, the result isn't chaos, it's apathy. The animals still can eat, they still can move, but they don't care to. They won't work for rewards, they won't explore, they just sit. This is a powerful reminder. Dopamine is not about liking, it's about moving toward what we like. Now reverse the fantasy. What if you could turn dopamine up? Perfectly, infinitely, always? What if every action gave you a reward hit? What if brushing your teeth felt like winning a Nobel Prize? What if sending an email felt like falling in love? It might sound amazing, but remember, dopamine isn't the reward, it's the promise of reward. So if everything promises greatness, nothing feels special, your brain adapts, it resets the baseline, and soon the extraordinary becomes expected. You would crave more, and feel less, and less. This is not a guess. It's a warning we've already heard. from those who struggle with substance addiction, where dopamine systems are pushed beyond their natural rhythm, when the pursuit takes over, when the joy disappears, when wanting becomes hollow. This is one of dopamine's darkest paradoxes. Too little, and life feels grey. Too much, and it burns you out. The middle, the dance between effort and rest, is where meaning lives. Let's ask another question. What if you could edit your desires? In the not-so-distant future with brain-computer interfaces or gene editing, it may be possible to rewire reward systems, to turn down the craving for junk food, to boost the drive for studying, to make exercise feel as good as chocolate cake. Would you do it? Would you shoulder tap your dopamine pathways and say, please learn to love what's good for me? Or, and this is the weirder part, what if someone else did it for you? What if governments or corporations had the ability to subtly steer your dopamine maps, to guide your habits, your goals, your dreams, not with orders, but with nudges? Not by saying do this, but by making this feel good. Some might say that's already happening. Via algorithms, via ads, via design that predicts what you'll find satisfying. When your reward system is shaped by an invisible hand, who are you really? Are you choosing, or are you being chosen? This is the speculative frontier, the ethical edge of neuroscience. Because dopamine is not neutral, it's programmable, it learns. And so the question becomes, what do you want your brain to find rewarding? Not what does it find rewarding now, but what do you wish it would? This is where hope meets agency. You can't control your chemistry, but you can shape your exposure, your attention, your rhythms. You can practice finding joy in different things, and over time the brain follows. Now, let's tilt further. What if there were a society without dopamine? A place where people still thought, but never wanted, still spoke, but never sought, still existed, but never chased. It might sound like enlightenment, but more likely it would feel empty. Because wanting is part of being human. Even animals seek warmth, safety, connection, a good patch of sun, and wanting, when balanced, gives life a kind of pulse, a thrum beneath the surface. Not desperation, just direction. So maybe the question isn't how to get rid of desire, but how to refine it, to aim it at better targets, to teach the brain to celebrate the process, not just the prize. What if that's the real future? Not high-tech, not sci-fi, but deeply simple, a world where we learn to love what's enough. And what if your own brain is already moving that way? Even now, this moment, you're listening to a voice, a soft voice perhaps, about a molecule, and yet something inside you said, yes, this. Not for fame, not for credit, just for the feeling. That's dopamine aligned. It doesn't have to be dramatic. Sometimes the truest reward is a whisper, not a roar. Here's another what if. What if dreams are dopamine without logic? In sleep, your prefrontal cortex rests, logic quiets, but dopamine regions, like the limbic system, stay active. This might explain why dreams feel urgent, bizarre, goal-oriented. You're chasing something, escaping something, trying to find, solve, fix, reach, return. But the paths never make sense. What if that's dopamine? Painting with abstract memory, a rehearsal, a reflection, a sorting. The brain says, what if this? What if that? And dopamine moves the dream forward, seeking, even while you sleep. And if that's true, then maybe you've been practicing curiosity your entire life, even in silence, even in sleep. Let's lean one step further. What if dopamine, this tiny chemical, this motivator of mice and men, is not just biological? What if it's cosmic, a built-in signal of aliveness? Like gravity pulls matter, maybe dopamine pulls awareness. Maybe it's the universe's way of helping consciousness move, a prompt to explore, a question, what's next? Not to find the answer, but to enjoy the asking. And in that way, dopamine isn't just a molecule, it's a mirror of what you value, of how you learn, of how you change. Because even now, as you lie there, you might be feeling something subtle, not a rush, not a craving, just an opening, a sense that you're part of something not just mechanical, but mysterious, that this tiny molecule, inside your brain, inside all brains, has helped shape everything from love to language, invention to addiction, music to movement, and yet it remains invisible. You can't see it, you can't touch it, but it touches you again and again. So here's one last what if. What if every moment of growth, every act of courage, every tiny yes was dopamine saying, "You're alive"? And what if every time you listened, you weren't just becoming more motivated, you were becoming more you? So here we are, at the end, or perhaps the middle, of a very quiet journey. You've wandered with me through something invisible, something that hums behind your habits, that leans softly into your every decision, that doesn't shout or scream, but pulses, steady as breath, beneath your story. Dopamine, a molecule, yes, but also a rhythm, a nudge, a memory, a question. We began with a whisper, a suggestion that maybe, just maybe, this chemical wasn't simply about pleasure, that it wasn't the villain of craving, or the puppet string of addiction, or the glitter of a good day, that maybe it was something deeper, a compass, not a craving. And as we walked, slowly, through its paths, through the ancient cells and modern labs, through boredom and brilliance, through music and motion and longing, we saw how it draws its circles not in the brain, but in life itself. We saw how it wakes with you, moves with you, learns with you, and quietly asks, what matters today? That's the thing about dopamine. It never tells you what to want. It listens to what you reward and reinforces it. It pays attention. It notices. You liked that? Let's try again. You finished that? Let's do more. You smiled there? I'm marking this spot. It doesn't judge. It just learns. And in that learning it builds you, one small loop at a time. That moment you felt proud of keeping a promise to yourself. That moment a song pulled you into your own body. That moment a laugh surprised you. That moment you chose patience over impulse. Each one, a thread in the tapestry. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. And over time, the pattern emerges. You don't become who you want to be all at once. You become it bit by bit, through what you choose to find rewarding, through what you allow your mind to savour, through what you repeat gently until it begins to feel like home. So the question becomes, what do you want to find rewarding? Not what have you been told to want, not what glows on screens or counts as success, but you, here, now. Is it stillness, creation, connection, growth? You can train your brain toward those things, slowly, tenderly. You can teach dopamine a new language, and it will listen. Because dopamine isn't in charge. You are. We spoke too of paradox, of how this molecule that pushes us forward also prevents us from arriving. How it celebrates not the destination, but the anticipation. And that can be tiring. It can make contentment feel like a horizon that keeps shifting. But there's beauty in that too, because it means you'll never run out of wonder. It means every day something in you is ready to explore, even if that exploration is as small as trying a new tea, or noticing the way morning light folds across your floor, or pausing, truly pausing, to feel your breath. There is reward in the tiniest things if you show your brain how to see them. So many of the world's spiritual paths, from mindfulness to mysticism, seem to understand this before science does. They teach repetition, presence, still joy. And now, research gently agrees, not in loud headlines, but in quiet studies, that consistent habits can stabilize dopamine loops. That ritual is a form of training. That gratitude, when practiced, lights up the reward centers. That service, helping others without needing applause, is its own kind of high. So maybe enlightenment isn't a burst of transcendence. Maybe it's a new dopamine map, one that rewards being, not just becoming. And maybe that's what sleep itself is, the letting go of becoming. For a few hours, no seeking, no next step, no unfinished task, just drift, just restoration, and even in sleep dopamine hums. It helps your brain consolidate memory, solidify learning, rewire reward, so this very moment, this listening, this wondering, it won't be lost. Your brain remembers, not with words, not with facts, but with quiet emotional fingerprints, traces, echoes. It might not recall every sentence, but it might recall how this made you feel. Safe, curious, seen. That's reward too. Let's revisit where we began. The idea that dopamine isn't the feeling of joy, but the sense that joy might be coming. It's a possibility engine, a hopeful hum, a chemical promise that tomorrow could be beautiful. And the more you notice what nourishes you, the more the promise becomes real. Even now, in this final stretch of quiet, your brain might be leaving little markers. This felt peaceful. This felt human. This felt like something worth returning to, not for the thrill, but for the rhythm. That's what this is, really. Not a lesson, not a lecture, but a rhythm. A way of remembering that science and softness are not opposites, that curiosity and calm can sit side by side, that your brain, with all its circuits and chemicals and loops, is not a machine to be hacked, but a garden to be tended, gently. And dopamine? It's the sunlight. Too much, and you burn. Too little, and you wilt. But just enough, and you grow. In your own way, in your own time. Let's end with a return to the you who began this journey and perhaps distracted, perhaps tired, perhaps just curious. And to the you who lies here now, a little slower, a little fuller, a little softer. Maybe not changed, but remembered. Remembered as someone whose mind is wired for wonder, whose body is shaped by seeking but capable of stillness, who can notice the pull of desire and not be pulled by it, who can smile at the whisper of dopamine and say, I see you, and I choose. That's a kind of magic, that is a kind of peace. So rest now, let your mind wander, let your system soften. You've learned, you've felt, you've arrived. And in this arrival, a new loop begins, one of gentler cravings, one of truer rewards, one of quiet joy, and maybe, just maybe, that is enough. So, where are you now? What time is it? Not on the clock, but in your day, your life, your heart. Maybe it's late. Maybe you've already half forgotten where you started. Maybe your eyes are fluttering closed, and this voice is drifting off like a tide. That's okay. That's more than okay. That's the whole point. Because here, in the stillness of this moment, dopamine doesn't need to pull you anywhere. You've arrived, without chasing, without striving. And if even a small part of this brought you peace, a spark of curiosity, a moment of recognition, a soft shift in how you see yourself, then I'm deeply, quietly grateful. You've given your attention, your most generous currency, to a molecule that lives in your shadow. And in doing so, you've turned on a little light. If this experience felt nourishing, if you'd like more stories whispered in the dark, more science wrapped in softness, you're always welcome to support this space. A like, a share, a kind comment, all gentle ways to say, more of this please, but only if it feels right. This isn't about metrics, it's about connection, a slow, human rhythm. So as we close tonight, I'll leave you with one last thought. You're not your thoughts, you're not your cravings, you're not your molecules, you're the one who notices them, the one who gently steers, the one who, in a world full of noise, paused just long enough to listen. And in that pause, you remembered something soft and true. That growth doesn't have to be a sprint. That stillness isn't wasted time. That curiosity can be restful. So sleep well, fellow traveller, wherever and whenever you are. Your mind has wandered, your body has softened, your chemistry has exhaled, and that's enough. Good night, and thank you, truly,